On December 17, 1938, an 8,000-ton ship left the port of Hamburg without almost anyone noticing. No reporters, no official announcement, no ceremony. Only the cold of the Elbe and 82 men setting course for the most inhospitable continent on the planet. The vessel was named Neuschwabenland. Its declared mission was to map an Antarctic territory that no German had ever stepped on. But what it would find, or what it would be said it found, would fuel decades of conspiracies that today, 80 years later, have not finished burning out. What happened after that expedition, the submarines that appeared in Argentina in 1945, the US military operation of 4,700 men in 1946, the classified nuclear explosions of 1958, created a narrative that reason has never managed to fully dismantle. Was there a secret Nazi base under the Antarctic ice? Did the U-boats arrive with Hitler on board? Why did the United States Navy deploy an aircraft carrier to explore a continent that no one claimed as a strategic priority? What follows is the attempt to answer them. The official answer was simple: whale fat. But that answer, while true, is not complete. In 1938, the German whaling industry was the second largest in the world. The fleet operated with 50 hunting ships and 7 factory ships distributed throughout the waters of the South Atlantic. That year, the fleet produced 492,532 barrels of oil in the 1938 to 1939 season, exploiting waters surrounding the Queen Maud Land sector in eastern Antarctica. Whale oil was the raw material for margarine, an essential component of the German diet in times of rationing, for soap, and above all for the glycerin used in the manufacture of nitroglycerin, the base explosive for almost all military ammunition. Without whale oil, the war economy of the Third Reich had a bottleneck that cost scarce foreign currency every season. The problem was equal parts legal and economic. Antarctic waters were under Norwegian influence. Oslo charged onerous concessions to foreign fleets operating in what it considered its sphere of influence. Great Britain did the same in the South Atlantic, where it imposed concession fees and restrictions on whaling activity. The German government wanted a territory of its own in Antarctica, a territory from which to operate without paying concessions to third parties. It was the commissioner of the 4-year plan, Air Marshal Hermann Göring, who approved the concept on May 9, 1938, after State Councillor Helmut Wohltat, the German official responsible for the whaling industry, presented the project to him. Wohltat identified an unclaimed sector between the Norwegian and British zones, the strip between 20 degrees west and 10 degrees east longitude, in the area that would be called Queen Maud Land. There, German ships operated without the physical presence of any power. The key was to arrive, map, claim, and establish a presence before Norway or Great Britain did. But the documents that historians Colin Summerhayes and Cornelia Ludecker analyzed, published in their 2012 book The Third Reich in Antarctica, edited by the Erskine Press, reveal that the expedition had secondary military objectives that were not made public. On the return trip, the Schwabenland was to explore the Brazilian islands of Ilha Trinidade and Ilhas Martin Vaz, almost 1,000 kilometers east of Vitoria in Brazil, as possible logistical support points for the German Navy, especially for U-boats operating in the South Atlantic. And according to historian William Mills in his 2003 work Polar Frontiers, Göring wanted information on the performance of aircraft in extremely low temperatures, knowledge that would prove useful according to the expedition's own report compiled later during the invasion of the Soviet Union, where Luftwaffe planes would face winters much more severe than calculated. That makes the expedition something more than state-funded geographical tourism. It was multiple strategic reconnaissance disguised as science. The man chosen to command it was Captain Alfred Richer, born on May 23, 1879, in Bad Lauterberg in the Harz Mountains. He was not a party man. He was a sailor, explorer, and pilot with an accredited and documented polar career. In 1912, as part of the German Arctic expedition led by Herbert Schröderstrans, he had been sent to Spitsbergen. The expedition failed when its members became trapped in the cold of the archipelago. Richer took command of the situation. He walked 210 kilometers in 7.5 days across the ice of the northeastern sector of Nordostlandet to reach the settlement of Longyearbyen, from where he organized the rescue teams that saved 6 of the 14 lost members. That experience, real, not theoretical survival, was exactly what the Kriegsmarine needed for an Antarctic expedition commander. In 1925, Richter joined Lufthansa as an aerial navigation specialist. In 1934, he divorced his Jewish wife, Susan Lowenthal, so as not to compromise his position in the War Department, a fact that the History.com source includes and that the Spanish Wikipedia article itself confirms. Goering chose him precisely because he was one of the few Germans with real Arctic polar experience, with knowledge of aviation, and with access to the Lufthansa network, whose crews would pilot and maintain the expedition's planes. The question that no one answered in 1938 was this: if the mission was whaling and scientific, why the secrecy? The Neuschwabenland set sail without prior announcement. The first official press release did not arrive until March 6, 1939, when the ship was already on its way back, and Walthert published a press release from Cape Town. The Hamburg press covered the return. Neither the Daily Telegraph nor the New York Times, which nevertheless published notes on the Norwegian claim to the area, published anything about the departure. The Argentine newspaper and the Berlin illustrated newspaper Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung only published a small map of the flights on May 25, 1939, drawn without the authorization of Commander Richter by the aviation mechanic Franz Preuschow, the so-called Preuschow map, which circulated widely and was incorporated into the 1939 Australian Antarctic map at a scale of 1 to 10 million. The secrecy in itself became the first mystery, a secrecy that did not last because the scientific results were published in German journals as early as 1939, but which in the post-war collective imagination acquired the texture of what is hidden because it is too dangerous to show. Along with the scientific instruments, the Dornier walls carried aluminum arrows 1.2 meters in length with 30-centimeter steel cones and 3 stabilizing fins stamped with swastikas. The plan was to drop them from the air to physically mark the territory that Germany would name Neuschwabenland. But on a critical flight, the pilots miscalculated the fuel and had to lighten the aircraft by throwing part of the equipment overboard, including several boxes of those arrows. They fell somewhere in the Antarctic interior. The exact coordinates are unknown, and no one went to collect them because there was no ground team, there was no base, and there was no map precise enough to guide a search. The German territorial claim over Neuschwabenland rested in practice on metallic objects that no one saw fall and that no one has found since then. Norway had formally proclaimed its sovereignty over that same area on January 14, 1939, 5 days before the Schwabenland reached the coast. Richter learned of this by radio and continued the mission. In 1951, Bonn's jurists treated the territory as a Norwegian zone, implicitly renouncing any claim without there having been any formal declaration of German sovereignty to annul. The arrows are still there, somewhere in the Antarctic interior, the only physical monument that the Third Reich built on that continent. On January 23, 1939, pilot Richard Schirmacher was flying over the coastal strip of Queen Maud Land in the Boreas when he saw something that broke the white monotony of the Antarctic landscape. A patch of bare rock, dark, ice-free, with what appeared to be several bodies of water inside it. The coordinates were approximately 11 degrees east, about 80 kilometers from the coast and several kilometers behind the edge of the ice shelf. The oasis measured 34 square kilometers. In it there were numerous small lakes of liquid water without ice on the surface in the month of January, the austral summer, yes, but on a continent where temperatures in January can perfectly drop to minus 15 degrees Celsius. The geographer of the expedition, Ernst Hermann, noted that the oasis presented favorable conditions for a future logistics base. Richter flew over it personally and reached the same conclusion, but that the lakes were too small for a Dornier wall to land on them. None of the expedition's flights landed in the oasis. Hermann published his explanation in 1942 in the book Deutsche Forscher im Südpolarmeer. The heat that kept the lakes of the Schirmacher oasis free of ice came from the volcanic activity of a line of weakness in the Earth's crust that crossed the Atlantic. In his theory, that line connected the volcanoes of the Central Atlantic, Jan Mayen, the Azores, Ascension Island, Tristan da Cunha, Bouvet Island, with Mount Erebus in the Antarctic Ross Sea passing through Queen Maud Land, heat from the Earth's mantle leaking to the surface. A geothermal system that could, in theory, maintain habitable temperatures in underground cavities in the region. The idea was seductive. It was partially correct in its structure. The Atlantic volcanoes do align along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is the active fracture between the American plate and the African plate. But Hermann committed a fundamental geographical error. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge ends at a ridge intersection at approximately 54 degrees south near Bouvet Island. From there, the ridge system turns eastward following the South Atlantic Ridge and the Southwest Indian Ridge. There is no active geological structure that continues southward from Bouvet to Queen Maud Land. The volcanoes and hydrothermal vents of the ridge system are all more than 1,200 kilometers north of the coast of Queen Maud Land. The documented Antarctic volcanoes, Mount Erebus at 3,794 meters of altitude on Ross Island, Deception Island in the Antarctic Peninsula, Mount Melbourne, Mount Berlin, are all in the opposite sector of the continent in West Antarctica. No significant volcanic or geothermal activity has been recorded in Queen Maud Land by any of the scientific teams, Norwegian, Soviet, West German, Indian, Japanese, South African, that have operated there since 1949. The real reason why the Schumacher Oasis is free of ice has to do with the atmospheric dynamics of Antarctica. Katabatic winds, masses of extremely cold and dry air that form over the polar plateau at between 2,500 and 3,000 meters of altitude and descend by gravity toward the coast, reach speeds of between 30 and 80 kilometers per hour in that area for consecutive months. Those dry winds create conditions of sublimation and evaporation that prevent snow from accumulating on the bare rock of the oasis. The heat that keeps the lakes liquid does not come from below. It comes from the austral summer sun, which in January illuminates the territory 24 hours a day and warms the dark rock, which in turn gives off that heat to the water. But in 1939, the expedition's geographer did not have those data. He wrote what he knew, or what he believed, about the geology of the Atlantic, and that mistaken explanation about the geothermal heat of Queen Maud Land became the foundation of one of the most persistent elements of the myth. The idea that under the Antarctic ice there existed naturally heated caverns where a base could operate indefinitely without the need for external fuel. The Schumacher Oasis exists. It is real and visible in satellite images. Today it houses Russia's Novolazarevskaya station and India's Maitri station. Its lakes, the same ones that pilot Schirmacher observed from the air in January 1939, are the subject of limnological research on the climatic history of Antarctica. Hermann's explanation was incorrect, but the image it created, a warm spot on the continent of ice, was too useful for the myth to be abandoned. On February 15, 1939, the Neuschwabenland left Antarctic waters. Upon arriving in Cuxhaven on April 11th, Richter already had a plan for the following season, to explore the Pacific sector between 80 degrees and 130 degrees west, where there was no claim by any country. The plan was never executed. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Third Reich's resources were directed toward the war effort. The second expedition was cancelled, the third as well, and historians Sommerhays and Ludecker, after extensively reviewing the available German archives, found no document indicating that Germany returned to Antarctica at any time between 1939 and the end of the war. This 20-year gap, between 1939 and 1959, when the first post-war German stepped on Queen Maud Land with a Soviet expedition, is the fertile field where the myth grew. An expedition that had mapped between 250,000 and 600,000 square kilometers in less than a month, discovered 3,000-meter mountains and a geological oasis in the ice and suddenly vanished without building anything or leaving any subsequent trace in the archives. Conspiratorial logic says that the absence of a trace is precisely the evidence that something was hidden. Historical logic says that the absence of a trace in archives that have been reviewed for decades is evidence that there was nothing to hide. In 1975, two authors published a volume in Toronto titled UFO's Nazi Secret Weapon. The names on the cover were W. Matten and C. Friedrich. The real name of the second, as documented by Sommerhays and Beeching in their 2007 investigation and as confirmed by Canadian researcher Manuel Prucci, cited in the acknowledgements of the article, was Ernst Christoph Friedrich Zündel. a German-born publisher, author, and neo-Nazi activist based in Canada, who between the 1970s and 1990s would be repeatedly prosecuted for publishing Holocaust denial material in Germany and Canada. His publishing house was called Samizdat Publishers, based in Toronto. The 1975 book and Friedrich's subsequent 1979 volume, Germany's Antarctic Claim, Secret Nazi Polar Expeditions, included two photographic falsifications that researchers identified by comparing the original images. The first falsification, a photograph on page 65 of the 1979 volume with the caption, "Seaplane moored in one of the warm water ponds." The image showed what appeared to be a seaplane on the surface of an ice-free lake in a rocky environment. The problem is that the photograph was a copy of an image published by Ernst Hermann in his 1942 book Deutsche Forscher im Südpolarmeer, on pages 164 to 165, with a completely different caption. Das erste deutsche Flugzeug ist am Rande des Südpolkontinents gelandet, which translates as, "The first German plane has landed on the edge of the South Pole continent." The image showed the seaplane Boreas moored to the edge of the sea ice, the floating ice pack at the boundary with the ocean, not in any inland lake. The ice plane in the photograph is as thick and as flat as ordinary sea ice, and the men in the image are standing on the ice looking down at the fuselage of the aircraft, something that would be impossible if they were on the shore of a lake. The second falsification, a variant of the same image in the 1975 volume by Matten and Friedrich, page 189, captioned as "German Seaplane over the Ice-Free Oasis, Warm Water Lakes." The flight logs of the expedition, published by Richer in the first volume of Results in 1942, confirmed that none of the flights over the Schirmacher Oasis ended in a water landing. Richer flew over the oasis and noted that the lakes were too small to operate a Dornier Wal, which needed approximately 500 meters of open water run to take off. Another photograph in Friedrich's text showed a submarine with drums on deck, with the insinuation that they were the 540 collis of cigarettes mentioned in the interrogation report of U-530, but converted into 540 large cans or barrels by Friedrich himself in the accompanying text. According to the NARA interrogation report, the United States National Archives, published in 1985, the 540 collis were cartons of cigarettes, colis being the French word for parcel or package. Friedrich converted them into 200-liter barrels. The photograph of the submarine with drums could be of any U-boat in any port. The chain is verifiable step by step. Hermann published the original photograph in 1942 with its correct context. Friedrich took that same image, changed the caption, and presented it as evidence of something that did not exist. When subsequent researchers wanted to cite photographic evidence of a German water landing in the lakes of the oasis, they cited Friedrich's book, which cited a falsified photograph from a book that said nothing of the sort. This is the generative mechanism of the myth, not manufacturing from scratch, but the documented misrepresentation of real material. An authentic photograph of the German expedition with its real historical context erased and replaced by a fictitious one. Sufficiently convincing for someone who does not know the original, sufficiently specific to look like primary evidence. At some point in 1943, it is claimed that Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz uttered the following words: "The German submarine fleet is proud to have built for the Führer, in another part of the world, a Shangri-La on land, an impregnable fortress." That quote appears in the books by Szabo from 1947, Matten and Friedrich from 1975, Buchner and Bernhardt from 1989, Stevens from 1997, Robert and Farrell from 2005. In each case, the author takes it from the previous one. None cites an original primary source. There is no recorded speech. There is no Naval Archive transcript. There is no German newspaper from 1943 that published those words. A second quote, supposedly from the Nuremberg trial of 1946, an impregnable fortress, a paradisiacal oasis in the midst of eternal ice, does not appear either in any verifiable transcript of the process whose archives are digitized and searchable since 2014. To gauge the weight of those quotes, one must know what Dönitz was doing in 1943. It was the year of Bloody May. 41 U-boats sunk in a single month by the combination of new Allied tactics and airborne radar. Dönitz provisionally withdrew the fleet from the North Atlantic on May 24th of that year, managing the worst operational crisis in the history of the Kriegsmarine. The idea that in this context he supervised the provisioning of an Antarctic base conflicts with everything that the Kriegsmarine archives reveal about his documented activities. And if he said anything about an impregnable fortress in another part of the world, he was most likely referring to the reinforced concrete bunkers of the Norwegian ports, Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, with roofs up to 7 meters thick designed to resist Allied bombings. On July 10, 1945, 2 months after the German surrender, U-530 entered the port of Mar del Plata under the command of 25-year-old Lieutenant Otto Vermuth. On August 17th, U-977 arrived, commanded by Oberleutnant Heinz Schaefer. Argentina had declared war on Germany on March 27, 1945, so both crews became prisoners of war and were interrogated by the Argentine, US, and Royal Navy for weeks. The interrogations, documented in the NARA archives published in 1985, focused on one question: had they evacuated Hitler or any other leader of the Third Reich? The interrogators ended up convinced that they had not. Vermuth and Schaefer were released. Schaefer published a book in 1952 with his account of the voyage, U-Boat 977, which researchers have been able to verify step by step. On July 16, 1945, 4 days after the arrival of U-530, the exiled Hungarian journalist Ladislas Szabo published an article in the Buenos Aires newspaper La Critica detailing Hitler's alleged escape by submarine to an Antarctic refugee he called the New Berchtesgaden. On July 18th, the Toronto Daily Star reproduced it under the headline, "Hitler's on Ice in Antarctic." In 1947, Szabo expanded the thesis in a book published in Paris. The delay of both submarines, which the myth interpreted as a detour to Antarctica, has a simple arithmetic explanation. U-530 operated off New York until May 7th, learned of the capitulation on the 8th, and took 61 days to reach Argentina, sailing at reduced speed to conserve fuel. U-977 spent 66 days submerged to bypass the British naval blockade before entering the South Atlantic. The calculations close without the need for any Antarctic detour. This is the question that no one asked in 1945 because asking it required technical and geographical data that the journalists covering the story did not have. Summerhays and Beeching answered it in 2007 with the rigor of someone who has access to the naval archives of NARA, NASA satellite data on Antarctic sea ice, and the technical specifications of Type 9C/40 and Type 7C/41 U-boats. The U-530 was a Type 9C/40. Its technical characteristics were well documented: surface speed 19 knots, 35 kilometers per hour, submerged speed 7.3 knots, 13.5 kilometers per hour, surface action radius of 22,150 kilometers at 10 knots, submerged radius of 100 kilometers at 4 knots before exhausting the batteries, operational diving depth 230 meters. The U-977 was a Type 7C/41 with a surface speed of 17.7 knots, submerged speed of 7.6 knots, action radius of 14,500 kilometers at 10 knots, and operational depth of 250 meters. The relevant months were June, July, and August of 1945, the middle of the austral winter. The satellite data compiled by NASA and published by Glorson and others in 1992 show that off Queen Maud Land, the sea ice extends approximately 500 kilometers from the coast in May and June and reaches 1,665 kilometers from the coast in July, August, and September. For U-530 to reach the Antarctic coast and return toward Argentina on its way to Mar del Plata, where it arrived on July 10th, it would have had to travel approximately 1,000 kilometers under the ice. U-977, which arrived later, would have needed to travel about 3,300 kilometers submerged under the sea ice to cover the same journey. Was it physically possible? World War II U-boats did not have independent oxygen production systems. To renew the air, the submarine had to force its hull toward the surface at least every 2 days, because without CO2 scrubbers, carbon dioxide levels became toxic within 48 hours. Under ice 1 to 2 meters thick, the typical thickness of winter Antarctic sea ice. Piercing the ice cover with the unreinforced hull of the submarine would have produced severe structural damage. U-boats of the era were not designed to operate under ice. Their hulls had a low freeboard steel superstructure, very close to the water level, especially vulnerable to the lateral pressures of ice. The empirical evidence of what Antarctic ice can do to a submarine was provided by Operation High Jump. The USS Senate, the only submarine of the expedition, was damaged in the austral summer of 1947 to 1948 by the movement of the summer pack ice, with ice of lesser thickness and lesser resistance than winter ice, and had to be towed to open waters by the icebreaker North Wind. The same pressure from ice floes that caused that incident was what sank Shackleton's Endurance in the Weddell Sea in October 1915 after being trapped for several months. The winter Antarctic wind also creates additional pressures, the katabatic and cyclonic winds acting on the surface of the pack ice pile plates on top of each other, forming pressure ridges that can reach several meters in height and exert lateral forces equivalent to thousands of tons on any hull that becomes trapped between them. Navigation in those conditions would have also been practically impossible. In the Antarctic winter, the sun does not appear above the horizon for weeks in Queen Maud Land. In June and July, the night is continuous. The usual clouds would have prevented taking references from stars. Sextants, the only navigation instruments available to the U-boats of 1945, are useless without celestial references. Navigating in total night among unmapped icebergs approaching a coast known only through oblique aerial maps with position errors of up to 50 kilometers would have been suicidal. Let us assume that U-530 or U-977 had somehow reached the coast. Researchers calculated the conditions they would have encountered. The average winter temperature at the Mauldheim base, on the coast of Queen Maud Land, at approximately 70 degrees south, was minus 26 degrees Celsius, according to data published by V. Hisdal in 1960, based on the Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition of 1949 to 52. The average wind speed was 15 knots, 28 kilometers per hour. The combination of that temperature and that wind generated a wind chill temperature of minus 40 degrees Celsius. Under those conditions, the 11 members of the NBS-A expedition who spent the winters of 1950 and 1951 in Mauldheim described that they remained inside their facilities throughout June, July, August, and most of September, without going outside except in emergencies. Any crew that had disembarked from a submarine in July 1945 on the coast of Queen Maud Land would have faced 250 kilometers of crevassed ice in total darkness at an effective minus 40 degrees Celsius without precise cartography of the terrain, without vehicles, without local guides, and without the possibility of rescue. They would not have reached the mountains. In 1989, H.A. Buchner and W. Bernhardt published Hitler's Ashes in Metairie, Louisiana. Bernhardt claimed to have been a crew member of U-530 and to have participated in 1945 in a mission to deposit Hitler's ashes, along with Nazi treasures in 6 bronze boxes with lead coating, in a cave in the Mühlig-Hofmann Mountains with steel walls and stairs. Furthermore, he claimed to have returned in May 1979 by seaplane to recover those boxes. The most immediate problem, the crew list of U-530, provided by the Argentine Navy in 1945 and published by Szabo in 1947, does not contain the name Bernhardt in any spelling variant, and the book presents an irreconcilable internal contradiction. On page 147, it claims that previous U-boat expeditions discovered the caves. On page 188, that it was the 1938-39 Richer expedition that did so. The physical verification of the alleged 1979 trip is equally devastating. NASA satellite data show that in June 1979, sea ice extended solidly from the coast of Queen Maud Land to 60 degrees south, covering the entire Weddell Sea. Bernhardt's account required his seaplane to land in the Weddell Sea to refuel alongside a Dutch fishing vessel, physically impossible under those ice conditions. And no one has explained how the crew of U-530 would have dragged several hundred kilograms of bronze and lead chests across 250 kilometers of crevassed ice without sleds, without dogs, and without motorized vehicles in 1945. To understand why the post-war imagination so easily accepted the idea of a Nazi base under the Antarctic ice, one must understand the occultism of the Third Reich. The Thule Society, Thule Gesellschaft, was founded in Munich in 1918 by the astrologer Rudolf von Sebottendorf. It combined anti-Semitism with Germanic mysticism and trained among its members Alfred Rosenberg, Rudolf Hess, Gottfried Feder, Karl Harrer, and Dietrich Eckart, who later played direct roles in the creation of the NSDAP. But what interests us here is the physical cosmology that the regime adopted, the Welteislehre, or world ice theory, proposed by the Austrian engineer Hans Herbiger in his 1913 book Glacial Cosmogonie. Herbiger maintained that the universe was born when a fragment of cosmic ice collided with the Sun, and that the resulting catastrophes, the Flood, the Ice Age, the fall of Atlantis, were recorded in the myths of all cultures. The Aryans descended from that Atlantic civilization destroyed by ice and were destined to reconstitute it. In 1935, Himmler established the Ahnenerbe, the ancestral research branch of the SS, to subsidize research into Aryan origins and Herbiger's theories. He sent playwright Edmund Kiss to Abyssinia, appointed Dr. Hans Robert Skultetus as head of the weather forecasting branch based on ice cosmology, and named Herbiger's son Führer of Cosmic Ice in 1936. Hitler incorporated the theory into his tabletop monologues and made some military decisions based on its premises. Cosmic ice experts delayed the V-2 rocket program several times for fear that an explosion in space would alter the cosmic balance. All this ideological scaffolding, prehistoric Aryan giants, Atlantis under the polar ice caps, geothermal heat as a trace of lost civilizations, created the cultural soil in which the myth of the Antarctic base found its internal logic. In November 1943, 2 Royal Navy ships left London for the Falkland Islands. They carried on board the first members of Operation Tabarin, a secret military mission authorized by the British Admiralty to establish permanent bases on the Antarctic Peninsula and surrounding islands. The code name was informal. Tabarin was the name of a famous totalitarian cabaret, and the operation remained classified for the duration of the war. The real objectives of Tabarin were pragmatic and immediate. Great Britain claimed as dependencies of the Falkland Islands the entire Antarctic sector, between 20 degrees west and 80 degrees west longitude, including the Antarctic Peninsula, the South Shetland Islands, the South Orkneys, the South Sandwich Islands, and South Georgia. The Admiralty Charts of 1908, amended in 1917, had formalized that claim, but Argentina had claimed the same territory since 1925 and Chile since 1940. Both countries, which in the early years of the war had maintained friendly relations with Germany, were placing sovereignty markers on the disputed islands. Argentina had installed signs on Deception Island in 1942. Great Britain needed a permanent physical presence. In March 1941, the HMS Queen of Bermuda had visited Deception Island to destroy coal stocks and puncture fuel tanks, preventing any vessel, German or of another nation, from using them. In January 1943, the HMS Carnarvon Castle had erased Argentine sovereignty markings and raised the Union Jack. But sporadic visits did not equate to continuous occupation. The Tabarin expedition, the members left the Falklands on January 29, 1944, first established Base B on Deception Island, arriving on February 3, 1944. It then attempted to establish Base D at Hope Bay at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, but bad weather prevented it. Instead, they founded Base A on Goudier Island in Port Lockroy, an inlet on the south coast of Winker Island in the Palmer Archipelago. These bases were minimal: 5 people on Deception Island in 1944, 9 in Port Lockroy that same year. The personnel included naval observers, radio operators, and scientists. The main activity was scientific, but presence was the point. In July 1945, Operation Tabarin was transferred from the Admiralty to the Colonial Office and converted into a civil organization, the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey, FIDS. Scientific work continued without interruption, and new bases were created. Base C at Cape Geddes in January 1946, Base E on Stonington Island in February 1946, Base F in the Argentine Islands in January 1947, Base G in Admiralty Bay in January 1947, and Base H on Seney Island in March 1947. This is where the writer J. Robert, in his 2005 trilogy published in Nexus magazine, an Australian magazine that does not use peer review, found the raw material for his version of the myth. The SAS regiment had been disbanded in October 1945, but 3 former SAS officers arrived in the region months later: Lieutenant Colonel Blair, Paddy Mayne, Major J. Tonkin, and Major M. Sadler. All 3 had been demobilized from the army upon the disbandment of the SAS and had signed 2-year civil contracts with the FIDS. The exact chronology has been documented by H. Ross in his biography of Mayne, published by Sutton Publishing in 2003, based on Mayne's personal diary and family papers. Mayne arrived in Montevideo on December 8, 1945, on his way to the Falklands. He arrived at Port Stanley on January 3, 1946. He set sail on January 9th, relieved the bases on Deception Island on January 13th and Port Lockroy on January 17th, and returned to Port Stanley on January 23rd. There he was hospitalized for severe back pain, the sequel to an old injury, and had to abandon the mission. He returned to the United Kingdom in March 1946. Tonkin and Sadler continued and established Base E on Stonington Island in February 1946. Robert's version turned these 3 men into SAS soldiers, which no longer existed, attacking a Nazi fortress in Queen Maud Land, 1,000 kilometers from the bases where they were actually working as civilians. Robert placed that supposed attack at Christmas 1945, but Mayne did not leave Montevideo until December 30, 1945. Physically, he could not have been fighting in Antarctica at Christmas that year. The proof that Robert mixed up an incorrect chronology comes from an earlier source that he used, the biography of Mayne written by Dillon and Bradford in 1987, Rogue Warrior of the SAS, which erroneously indicates that Mayne arrived in the Falklands in September 1945. Ross showed in 2003 that this piece of information was incorrect using Mayne's own diary. Robert took the erroneous date from Dillon and Bradford and built upon it a narrative where the SAS could have been training in the Falklands in October 1945 for an Antarctic mission. The source was wrong from the beginning. When Summerhays contacted Robert directly to verify the story of the SAS officer, Robert revealed that the source was not the survivor himself, but a close relative now deceased who had told him the story. A second-hand, unverifiable testimony from an anonymous witness who could no longer be questioned. Operation High Jump, authorized on August 26, 1946 by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, was the largest polar expedition in history up to that point. 4,700 men, 33 aircraft, 13 ships including the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea and the submarine USS Senate under the command of Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen. There were 11 journalists on board who between December 1946 and March 1947 transmitted 2,011 messages totaling 478,338 words. The official report was published by the Navy in 3 volumes and classified as confidential, the lowest level of the American system, never as secret or top secret. The strategic context was the nascent Cold War. The Joint Chiefs of Staff considered a polar conflict with the Soviet Union plausible, and High Jump was a naval training exercise under extreme ice conditions, equivalent to Operations Frostbite and Nanook carried out in the Arctic in 1945-46. The expedition focused on Byrd's Little America 4 base, on the Ross Ice Shelf, on the opposite side of the continent from Queen Maud Land. The Western Group flew over the eastern tip of Queen Maud Land on February 22, 1947. The Eastern Group attempted to approach from the west on March 1st, but the weather was so bad, clouds from the surface up to 4,500 meters, that it could not explore the continent and departed on March 3rd without having flown over it. The expedition ended earlier than planned, not because it was attacked, but because the second icebreaker, the USS Burton Island, arrived late. The pack ice turned out to be 1,000 kilometers wider than expected, and the Antarctic winter arrived early. The only aircraft lost crashed on December 30, 1946, during a whiteout at 71 degrees 22 minutes south, 99 degrees 20 minutes west, on the opposite side of the continent from Queen Maud Land without any involvement of secret German weapons. On March 5, 1947, while the high jump ships were sailing back to the United States, The Chilean newspaper El Mercurio published on its page 23 an interview with Admiral Richard E. Byrd, signed by correspondent Lee Van Atter of International News Service. That article was the source of one of the most effective misrepresentations of the entire Antarctic Nazi mythology. The phrase that Mattern and Friedrich published in 1975 as a quote from Byrd stated, "In case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by flying objects that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds." This version, or variants of it, was repeated by Robert in 2005A, 2005B, and 2005C, by Coron at an unknown date, and by Farrell in 2005. Farrell even incorporated into Chapter 14 of his book a copy of the original Spanish text alongside what he described as the English translation, without apparently noticing, or without wanting to notice, that the two versions did not say the same thing. Summerhays and Beeching obtained the original text from El Mercurio of March 5, 1947, with the help of Sandra Valenzuela from the National Library of Chile in Santiago. What the Spanish text said was completely different from what Friedrich and his successors claimed. Byrd explained that the United States had to adopt protection measures against the possibility of an invasion by hostile aircraft coming from the polar regions. He clarified that he was not trying to alarm anyone, but that in the event of a new war, the country could be attacked by aircraft flying over one or both poles. That was all. The Admiral spoke about the speed with which the world was shrinking geographically, that distances, oceans and poles were no longer a guarantee of security for the United States as they had been in the past. The central point of the article was the strategic importance of the high jump results for national defense against a Soviet threat. There were no flying objects. There were no incredible speeds. Byrd's hostile aircraft were Soviet bombers that in 1947 were beginning to constitute a real threat. The Soviet Union was developing its own long-range bombers capable of crossing the Arctic. The phrase from Mattern and Friedrich is at best a translation so loose that it ceases to be a translation. At worst, it is a deliberate falsification, which fits the pattern established by their photographic falsification of the Schumacher Oasis. Regarding flying saucers, the story that the high jump planes were attacked by secret German weapons has a birth date that Goodrich Clark establishes precisely. Flying saucers as a cultural phenomenon began in the United States on June 14, 1947, with the incident in Roswell, New Mexico. The first connection between post-war sources and Nazi fugitives in the Southern Hemisphere was made by M.X. Barton in 1960 and 1968 in his books We Want You, Is Hitler Alive? And The German Saucer Story, both published by Futura Press in Los Angeles. The first explicit association between Nazi saucers and Antarctica belongs to Mattern and Friedrich in 1975. The myth of Antarctic flying saucers has less than 50 years of existence at the time of the publication of Summerhays' study. The only plane that high jump lost was the one that crashed on December 30, 1946, during a whiteout on the opposite side of the continent. There is no record in any of the 2011 dispatches that the 11 journalists sent from the expedition's ships that any plane was attacked or disappeared in Queen Maud Land. The source for Buchner and Bernhardt regarding the 4 planes supposedly destroyed by secret German weapons was a European publication called Brisant, which the authors themselves admitted they had been unable to locate, and the novel Genesis by W.A. Harbinson, published in 1980, which was declared fiction. If the base existed, where exactly was it? This question reveals more transparently than any other the internal inconsistency of the myth, because the promoters of the story themselves cannot agree even to the kilometer. Szabo, in his 1947 book, placed it in the Schumacher Oasis near 12 degrees east on the eastern side of Queen Maud Land. He further argued that it was the German expedition itself that established an initial coastal base there, that this base was then used by German commerce raiders in the South Atlantic, and that U-boats brought materials to build an installation inland. 3 distinct functions: coastal base, commerce raider provisioning, and redistribution point toward the interior. Mattern and Friedrich, in 1975, placed the base in an area centered at 75 degrees south and 40 degrees east, coordinates that lie far to the east of the area explored by the 1938-39 expedition, which did not go beyond 15 degrees east longitude. This localization to the east was necessary for their account to be internally consistent. The planes of Operation High Jump had to have flown over the base for the alleged attack to make geographical sense. But the coordinates of the base they propose contradict their claim that the base was in the area explored by the Germans. Landig, in his 1980 novel Wolfszeit Thule, a work of fiction that Stevens later cites as a historical source, placed it near 12 degrees east in the Voltat Massif, between the Conrad Mountains to the west and the Richer Peak to the east, inland from the Schirmacher Oasis and east of the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains. Buchner and Bernhardt, in 1989, placed it in the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains, claiming that Richer had discovered natural ice caves there. But on page 147 of the same book they wrote that shore parties from early U-boat expeditions had discovered one or more natural ice caves, contradicting the authorship of the discovery they attribute to Richer on page 188. Stevens, in 1997, placed it at 71 degrees 30 minutes south, 14 degrees 51 minutes west, a point that, according to maps of Queen Maud Land, lies on the open slopes of the ice sheet approximately halfway between the Schirmacher Oasis and the Voltat Massif, about 150 kilometers from the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains. And he cited as a source for the information on the base's activity during the war some novels by Landig, which he describes as sources that describe this and other secret German post-war bases in Antarctica. Robert, in 2005, placed it within 320 kilometers of where the British built their own secret wartime base, and he identified that British base as Maudheim. But Maudheim is the name of the base of the Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition of 1949 to 52. Robert assumed that a supposed secret British wartime base was in the same place as Maudheim, which is contradictory. If it was so secret that it had no name or coordinates on official maps, how did a post-war expedition find it by chance in 1950 without knowing it was there? The Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains, which Robert mentions as the probable location, are at least 440 kilometers east of Maudheim, not within the 320 kilometers he claims. In short, 8 different authors, 8 different locations, none coinciding with another and none backed by any original document. There is also a logistical consideration that everyone ignores. The Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains are 200 to 250 kilometers inland from the coast, at 1,500 meters above sea level, in a region of Antarctica where snowfall is minimal. It is a polar desert. The only access routes from the coast would have been through an ice sheet penetrated by hidden crevasses. Under winter conditions, with 24-hour darkness and temperatures of minus 50 degrees Celsius in the mountains, any operation to transport construction materials would have required a logistical infrastructure comparable to that of the Eastern Front supply lines. Germany did not have that infrastructure available in Antarctica at any point between 1939 and 1945. In 1949, 3 years after the end of the war, the Norwegian-British-Swedish expedition began to establish its Maudheim base in Queen Maud Land. The members arrived at their definitive site on February 15, 1950, according to the account of the expedition leader John Gaiva, published in The White Desert in 1954 by Chatto and Windus in London. Gaiva describes the process of choosing the site as a decision made on the ground, guided by ice conditions and the logistics of unloading from the ships. There is no mention in his account of finding any prior facility, any sign of previous occupation, or any object or structure that did not belong to the expedition. The 3 years that the NBSA expedition spent in the region, 1949 to 1952, included extensive explorations of the interior. The Mühlig-Hoffmann, Voltat and Sorrondan mountains were the subject of reconnaissance by sled and plane. The scientists, Norwegian, British and Swedish, measured, photographed and mapped the region in detail. The field measurements they obtained were what made it possible to correct the position and altitude errors of the 1939 German aerial maps. None of them reported finding any trace of prior human presence in the interior. In 1957 to 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, the IGY, the largest internationally coordinated scientific research project up to that date, Norway and Belgium established permanent bases in Queen Maud Land. The Norwegian base Troll and the Belgian base Roy Baudouin provided a continuous human presence in the region. Scientists from both nations conducted regular excursions into the interior without finding any unidentified installations. Since the 1970s, the region has been mapped by Landsat satellites with a resolution that allows the identification of objects a few meters in diameter. Carsten Brunk used those images in the 1980s to reconstruct the exact routes of the Boreas and Passat flights in 1939, comparing the topography visible on the satellites with the oblique aerial photographs of the expedition. The analysis produced corrected maps published by the Bundesamt für Kartographie und Geodäsie in Frankfurt. There is no anomaly in those images that suggests the presence of artificial structures from the World War II era. Today, more than 12 permanent or semi-permanent scientific stations operate in Queen Maud Land. Germany has the Neumayer 3 base, operational since 2009, with capacity for 40 people in summer and 9 in winter. India has the Maitree station and the more recent Bharati station in the Shirmacher Oasis. Russia operates Novolazarevskaya, also in the Shirmacher Oasis. South Africa has Sanai 4. Japan has Siowa. Norway has Troll, which is the only Antarctic base with an intercontinental runway used for direct flights from Cape Town. Air traffic over the region has increased dramatically since the 1990s. More than 1,000 scientists have worked in Queen Maud Land between 1949 and 2025. None has found anything resembling a military facility from World War II. The arguments of those who maintain that the base existed but has been covered by snow are not applicable to the mountainous interior. In the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains, where the wind prevents snow accumulation, any metallic structure from the Nazi era would be on the surface or at a very shallow depth. It would be visible in high-resolution satellite images. It is not seen. The director of the British Antarctic Survey, C. Rapley, noted in 2006 that an atmospheric nuclear explosion over Queen Maud Land would have left an unmistakable peak in the radioactivity records of Antarctic ice cores. Ice cores from Coates Land, southwest of Queen Maud Land, published by Wolf, Sutty and Peel in Atmospheric Environment in 1999, show the diffuse radioactive contamination from Soviet and American nuclear tests of the 1950s and 1960s, which dispersed globally. There is no local peak in 1958 that would correspond to a detonation over Antarctica. The narrative of a habitable Antarctic base required a solution to the most immediate problem of any facility on that continent: the cold. A base in the Mühlig-Hoffmann Mountains would face temperatures as low as minus 50 degrees Celsius in winter, and winds of 100 kilometers per hour. To keep any facility operational, with laboratories, machinery, quarters for personnel, and communication systems, energy was needed on an industrial scale. The promoters of the myth resolved this problem with geothermal heat. The idea came from Hermann and the inferences that several authors made about the Schirmacher Oasis. Friedrich and his successors went further. They maintained that a submarine volcanic line of weakness ran along the ocean floor under the coastal ice of Queen Maud Land, providing not only heat but also a submarine access channel that U-boats could navigate to directly enter the mountains without exposing themselves on the surface. The real geology is as follows: the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, the active fracture between the North American Plate and the Eurasian Plate in the north, and between the South American Plate and the African Plate in the south, reaches its southernmost point in the South Atlantic Ridge system at approximately 54 degrees south, near Bouvet Island. From there, the ridge system does not continue southward but turns eastward following the southwest Indian Ridge. All hydrothermal and volcanic activity associated with the Mid-Atlantic Ridge remains north of 60 degrees south, more than 1,200 kilometers from the coast of Queen Maud Land. In Antarctica, known volcanoes are concentrated in the western sector. Mount Erebus on Ross Island at 77 degrees south is the most active Antarctic volcano, with a height of 3,794 meters and active lava in its crater. Deception Island in the South Shetlands experienced eruptions in 1967, 1969 and 1970 that destroyed parts of the Chilean and British base facilities established there. Mount Berlin, Mount Sidley and Mount Takahe are other volcanoes in the western Antarctic sector. All are in the opposite sector to that of Queen Maud Land. Subglacial lakes exist under Antarctica. Lake Vostok, beneath the Russian station of the same name, is the largest, with dimensions of 250 by 50 kilometers and a maximum depth of 1,000 meters. But these lakes are beneath 3 to 4 kilometers of ice, not in accessible caves. They are formed by the combination of basal geothermal heat, the residual heat from the Earth's interior, which in Antarctica is about 50 milliwatts per square meter, and ice pressure, which lowers the melting point of water. There is no airspace above those lakes. They are completely enclosed between rock and ice. No human being could live in them. The idea of the submarine channel under the ice for U-boats has also been geophysically dismantled. Summerhays and Beeching explain that the floating ice shelf on the coast of Queen Maud Land has a thickness of approximately 200 meters according to measurements from the NBSA expedition. The grounding line, the point where the shelf touches the seabed and becomes continental ice, is between 300 and 1,000 meters deep underwater. World War II, U-boats had an operational depth of 230 to 250 meters. They could not navigate below the grounding line, and the channels cut by glaciers into the seabed during the last ice age, well documented in the Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea, become sealed by continental ice where they venture past the grounding line. They are not access routes for submarines. Under real Antarctic conditions, U-boats from 1944 or 1945 attempting to navigate under the ice shelf in search of a submarine channel would have encountered an ice and rock cul-de-sac a few kilometers from the coast. The last German secret was finally destroyed when 3 atomic bombs were detonated over it in 1958 under the cover of the International Geophysical Year. This assertion, or some variant of it, appears in the texts by H. Stevens from 1997 and 2003, J. Robert from 2005, and J. P. Farrell from 2005. Stevens takes the information from Wilhelm Landig's 1991 novel Rebellen für Thule, a novel. Declared fiction, used as a historical source. There were indeed 3 secret nuclear explosions in the Southern Hemisphere in 1958. Operation Argus is a verified fact, publicly confirmed years later and mentioned in detail by Walter Sullivan in his 1961 book Assault on the Unknown, published by McGraw-Hill in New York, and by Lars Erik de Geer, a representative of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization with whom Summerhays communicated directly in January 2006. The exact coordinates, weapon types, and dates of Operation Argus are documented. The first detonation occurred on August 27, 1958, at an altitude of 160 kilometers over the coordinates 38 degrees south, 12 degrees west, 3,500 kilometers north of the coast of Queen Maud Land. The second on August 30th at an altitude of 290 kilometers over 50 degrees south, 8 degrees west, 2,280 kilometers to the north. The third on September 6th at an altitude of 750 kilometers over 50 degrees south, 10 degrees west, 2,390 kilometers to the north. All occurred over the South Atlantic Ocean, approximately 1,760 kilometers southwest of the Cape of Good Hope. The warheads used were of the W-25 type, designed for air-to-air missiles. Operation Argus was a scientific military experiment to study how charged particles and radioactive isotopes released into the upper atmosphere would interact with the Earth's magnetic field. The strategic objective was to evaluate whether a nuclear detonation in the atmosphere could create an artificial radiation belt, similar to the Van Allen belts, that would interfere with enemy radar, communications, and the electronics of satellites and ballistic missiles. It was physics research applied to weaponry, not an attack on any surface target. The numbers completely disprove the thesis of a detonation over Antarctica. The first explosion occurred 3,500 kilometers north of the Antarctic coast. Even if the radioactive effects dispersed southward, which atmospheric physics makes plausible on a global scale, the local concentration over Queen Maud Land would have been minimal and delayed, not the impact of a bomb on a target a few kilometers away. The geochemical evidence is definitive. The British Antarctic Survey extracts ice cores from various parts of Antarctica that record atmospheric deposition year by year for thousands of years. Ice cores from Coates Land, southwest of Queen Maud Land, on the eastern edge of the Weddell Sea, published by Wolf and others in Atmospheric Environment in 1999, show a gradual increase in beta radioactivity since 1954, with peaks in the early 1960s, when the Soviet Union conducted its most massive nuclear tests in the Arctic, including the detonation of the 57-megaton Tsar bomber in October 1961. This increase reflects the global distribution of radioactive contamination from nuclear tests in the Northern Hemisphere that dispersed throughout the entire atmosphere. There is no anomalous local peak in 1958 in the cores that would correspond to a detonation over Antarctica. Furthermore, in 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, there were Norwegian, Belgian, British and Japanese scientists living and working at permanent stations in Queen Maud Land. A nuclear detonation in the atmosphere over that area would have exposed those scientists to lethal doses of radiation. The idea that the United States would detonate nuclear bombs over territory where citizens of Allied nations lived, in the middle of the Cold War, when the maintenance of Western alliances was strategic priority number one, is politically absurd beyond any calculation of plausibility. The Antarctic Nazi myth has several layers, and the most recent, chronologically, is that of the flying saucers. Its date of incorporation into the narrative is precisely verifiable, and that verification reveals something interesting. The most spectacular layer of the myth is also the youngest. Flying saucers as a massive cultural phenomenon began in the United States on June 24, 1947, when aviator Kenneth Arnold described seeing 9 crescent-shaped flying objects in Washington at speeds of over 1,900 kilometers per hour. The press dubbed them flying saucers. A few weeks later, in July, the Roswell incident, a high-altitude balloon from the Mogul surveillance project that crashed on a New Mexico ranch, was interpreted by some as an extraterrestrial saucer. UFO fever had begun. In 1960 and 1968, M.X. Barton published 2 books. We Want You, Is Hitler Alive? And the German Saucer Story through Futura Press in Los Angeles, suggesting that the Germans were assembling flying discs in underground factories in South America, South Africa, and possibly Antarctica, although Barton focused mainly on Patagonia. The first explicit and articulated connection between flying saucers, Antarctica, and Operation High Jump belonged to Matten and Friedrich in 1975. According to Nicholas Goodrick Clark in his 2002 analysis published by New York University Press under the title Black Sun, Aryan Cults, Esoteric Nazism and the Politics of Identity, it was in the 1970s when Wilhelm Landig and Ernst Zundel, both neo-Nazi publishers and authors, blended these stories, suggestions and insinuations into a powerful and elaborate myth of Nazi resurgence. The myth of the Last Battalion, a massive force of Nazi UFOs in possession of a vast expanse of Antarctica, took shape in that decade. The Hollow Earth theory, which maintained that humanity lived on the inside of a sphere, had its own antecedents in the Nazi imagination. A follower of that theory, surnamed Neupert, had published his ideas in Germany after World War I, maintaining that the Earth was a spherical bubble with humanity inside. In 1942, Dr. Heinz Fischer, an expert on infrared rays, led a party of approximately 10 men to the island of Rügen in the German Baltic to photograph the British fleet, pointing camera equipment upward at 45 degrees, on the theory that if the Earth were hollow, infrared rays would follow the interior curvature and reach the shores of Great Britain. The article in Popular Astronomy of June 1946 that described this experiment called it German astronomy during the war. The infrared rays did not work in the direction Fischer expected. The British fleet was not located. The fusion of the hollow Earth with Antarctica produced a complete cosmology. The original Aryans, whose Atlantic civilization had been destroyed by Herbiger's cosmic ice, had taken refuge in the interior of the Earth, accessible through the polar openings. The Nazis had found those openings. Their flying saucers emerged from the hollow interior of the planet. Antarctica was the gateway. This cosmology had no geological basis whatsoever. The interior of the Earth is composed of a solid iron and nickel core of approximately 1,220 kilometers in radius, surrounded by a liquid outer core, both at temperatures between 5,000 and 6,000 degrees Celsius. Seismic data demonstrating this structure accumulated during the 20th century through the analysis of seismic waves from earthquakes that pass through the planet. There are no habitable cavities. There are no polar openings. But the hollow Earth cosmology did not need geological evidence either to fulfill its function in the myth. It fulfilled a narrative function. to explain why the Nazi base had never been found. If the base was beneath the ice and then beneath the planet, any absence of surface evidence was to be expected. The myth had become hermetic. In 2005, between August and December, the Australian magazine Nexus magazine published J. Roberts articles in 3 installments under the collective title Britain's Secret War in Antarctica. Nexus was and is an alternative topics publication that does not submit its articles to peer review. Roberts' trilogy was subsequently one of the most cited works in the literature of the Antarctic Nazi myth. Roberts' account contained several central elements: that the Germans built a base in Queen Maud Land during World War II, that the British knew about that base and built their own secret base in the same area to monitor it, that the SAS attacked the Nazi base around Christmas 1945 in a mission that failed, that Operation High Jump of 1946-47 also failed in its attempt to destroy it, and that finally 3 atomic bombs detonated over the base in 1958 under cover of the International Geophysical Year. All of this had been deliberately suppressed by the British and American governments. The source for all this information was, according to Robert in his 2005 article, the last survivor of the SAS attack, who gave me the following account. But in direct communication with Peter Beeching, one of the 2 authors of the Summerhaze study, on October 26, 2005, Robert modified his story. The source was not the survivor himself, but a close relative, now deceased, who had told him the story second-hand. Robert added that he could not give the name of the witness because he, Robert, worked for the Ministry of Defence of the United Kingdom. This attribution of anonymity for reasons of government employment is irrefutable by design. No one can verify that Robert worked for the MOD, no one can verify the existence of the deceased relative, and no one can interrogate the alleged SAS officer because he is dead, if he ever existed. It is the type of evidence that fulfills all the formal requirements of a testimony while making its verification impossible. The chronological problems of Robert's account are multiple and independently verifiable from the testimony. The SAS regiment was disbanded in October 1945. This is documented in British Army records. It was not reconstituted until 1948. Any SAS operation in December 1945 would have had to be executed by a regiment that no longer existed. Robert responded to this objection by suggesting that the operation was unofficial and carried out by ex-SAS members still under some kind of tacit order. But if it was unofficial, who authorized it? Who funded it? How did they get to Antarctica? The alleged British base, Mordheim 1, which Robert claimed was established during the war to monitor the Germans, does not appear in any records of Operation Tabarin, whose complete history was published by Sir Vivian Fuchs in Of Ice and Men in 1982, by R.K. Headland in Chronological List of Antarctic Expeditions in 1989, and by H. Squires in SS Eagle, The Secret Mission in 1992. The archives of Operation Tabarin were opened to the public and reviewed by J. Ray in 1995, a reference documented by Summerhaze. None of those files mention a base in Queen Maud Land. Robert stated that the Mordheim 1 base was in the same place as the Maudheim of the 1949-52 NBSA expedition. But Giaeva describes in The White Desert from 1954 that the site of Maudheim was selected on the ground in February 1950 due to practical conditions of access and topography, and that there was no sign of prior occupation. If a secret British base had been exactly there during the war, the NBSA expedition would have found something. Construction materials, abandoned equipment, fuel depots, at least remnants of structures. It found nothing. But perhaps the most telling feature of Robert's text is none of these factual problems. It is the epistemological structure of the narrative. Every possible objection already has an answer incorporated into the text. The base was destroyed, or it is under the ice, or it was cleaned up, or the documents were suppressed, or the witnesses have died. The myth is circular. It cannot be refuted because any absence of evidence is evidence of the conspiracy that suppresses it. This is the defining characteristic of well-constructed conspiracy theories. They offer no condition of falsifiability. There is no empirical finding that can refute them from within their own logic, and that makes them, in epistemological terms, equivalent to religion. a belief system that does not need evidence to sustain itself because it has incorporated the absence of evidence as part of its own assumptions. This is the mystery that no geologist can solve with rock samples, no historian with declassified archives, no physicist with radioactivity data. It is a mystery about collective psychology and the cultural function of great modern myths. The verifiable facts are all on the table. The German archives of the 1938-39 expedition were published by Richter in 2 volumes in 1942 and 1958. The interrogation records of U-530 and U-977 were published by the National Archives of the United States in 1985. The 3 volumes of the Operation High Jump report were declassified decades ago. Satellite data on Antarctic sea ice cover the region since 1972. Antarctic ice cores have been analyzed to detect radioactive contamination with results published in indexed scientific journals. More than 1,000 scientists have worked in Queen Maud Land without finding a trace of military installations from World War II. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge ends more than 1,200 kilometers north of the Antarctic coast. World War II. U-boats did not have CO2 scrubbers and could not navigate under winter ice spanning 1,665 kilometers. And yet, as of June 2025, an internet search for Nazi base Antarctica yields millions of results. The books by Farrell, Stevens, and the heirs of Robert's narrative continue to sell. YouTube channels on the subject accumulate tens of millions of views. The Antarctic Nazi base is today one of the most recognizable conspiracy myths in the world. To understand why, one must return to the origin. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Eva Braun died alongside him. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery courtyard. The witnesses, among them chauffeur Erich Kempka, Reich Press Chief Heinz Lorenz, Secretary Traudl Junge, and several members of the personal guard, described the events with substantial consistency. But in July 1945, when Ladislas Szabo published his article in La Critica, the witnesses were imprisoned or dispersed. The Allies had not found identifiable remains, and the entire world wanted to know with absolute certainty what had happened to the man who had unleashed the most destructive war in history. The uncertainty surrounding Hitler's death, which in forensic investigation was not definitively resolved until 2018, when a team of French scientists analyzed teeth preserved in Russian archives and confirmed their identity by comparison with previous dental records, was the void in which Szabo planted the seed of the myth, a void that was later occupied by the most emotionally satisfying narrative. The bad guy didn't die. He escaped. He is hidden, and his heirs are still there, waiting. The myth of the Antarctic base fulfills several cultural functions simultaneously. For those who cannot accept that the horror of the Third Reich was a purely human phenomenon, rationality converted into an instrument of evil, it offers a supernatural explanation. The Nazis had occult knowledge, impossible technology, a cosmic project that transcends ordinary history. The evil that produced Auschwitz was not ordinary. It was of another nature. It needed an extraordinary refuge, caverns under the Antarctic ice, heated by non-existent volcanoes, accessible only by submarines that navigated under kilometers of winter pack ice. For the heirs of Nazism, and the myth was created in its most elaborate versions by Zündel and Landig, both declared neo-Nazis. The myth fulfills a different function. The Nazis did not lose the war. They retreated strategically. The last battalion is waiting in Antarctica. One day they will return. This narrative, which Goodrich Clark documents in Black Sun with the academic rigor of an Oxford University professor, is not a literary accident. It is political propaganda framed as historical fiction. For the ordinary consumer of the myth, the viewer of the YouTube documentary, the airport bookstore reader, the function is simpler. The world is more interesting if it has gigantic secrets. If governments hide truths that would change everything. If beneath the most remote ice on the planet there is something that the established power does not want us to know. Postmodernity distrusts institutions and official narratives, and the Antarctic Nazi myth is the most spectacular version of that distrust applied to World War II. The mechanisms of the myth's propagation have also evolved. Szabo published in a newspaper and then in a Parisian book in 1947. Friedrich and Martin published through their own publishing house in Toronto in 1975. Today, any claim can circulate globally in hours, reinforced by algorithms that favor content that generates an emotional reaction, validated by networks of users who share not what is true, but what confirms their prior beliefs. The Antarctic Nazi myth on YouTube is larger in 2025 than at any previous point in its history. It has better graphics, more dramatic music, and narrators with deeper voices. The declassified archives remain online, accessible to anyone who wants to read them. Most do not read them. What the real history of the 1938-39 expedition offers is, in its own way, extraordinary enough. 82 men crossed the South Atlantic in an 8,000-ton ship in the Antarctic summer of 1939. They catapulted 10-ton seaplanes from the deck over waters that no German had flown over before. They photographed 600,000 square kilometers of ice, mountains, and rock in 27 days of operations. They discovered a geological oasis that even today houses the scientific stations of two countries. They mapped the first aerial charts of an 800-kilometer-long mountain range, and then they returned home without having built anything, without having left anything but the tracks of the planes in the air and the aluminum arrows that no one found. The Neuschwabenland expedition was a reconnaissance foray that was interrupted by the war before producing any practical results. There was no new Berchtesgaden. There were no caverns with steel stairs. There were no U-boats with the Führer's ashes. There was ice, unmapped mountains, a minus 26 degrees Celsius wind, and 82 men who did their job and went home. Antarctica hides no Nazi secrets. It guards the cold, the silence, and 11,600 oblique photograms of a territory that took decades to be correctly mapped. The myth does not need evidence because it never had any, but it does not seem to need it to survive either. And that, more than any cavern under the ice, is the real mystery.